If you had discovered a life-changing secret on your wedding night, would you have stayed or would you have walked away into the snow? Keep that question close because before this story ends, you will have to answer it for yourself. And if you are listening tonight from somewhere far from Wyoming, somewhere warm, somewhere safe, tell us in the comments where you are joining us from. Now let the fire catch and let the story begin. Wyoming Territory in the winter of 1882 was a country that measured a person's worth by what they could survive. The land stretched flat and pale for miles in every direction, broken only by the dark, jagged teeth of the Bighorn Range rising far to the west. And the wind that came down off those mountains carried a cold with real intent behind it, a cold that found the seams in a coat and the cracks in a cabin wall as surely as any thief found an unlocked door. Ranchers here buried neighbors some winters more often than they buried worn-out horses. Towns survived by clustering close and helping one another because the alternative solitude in a country this vast and this indifferent was a slower and crueler kind of death than any blizzard could deliver outright. The storm came down from the Bighorn Mountains like something with a grudge to settle. It had been building since noon, a gray wall stacking itself against the peaks, and by the time the light began to fail, the wind had found its voice. It screamed low across the open plains of Wyoming Territory, driving snow sideways in ropes that stung any exposed skin like a thrown handful of gravel. Fence posts vanished. The road out of town disappeared beneath a smooth, cruel blankness that erased every wagon rut and hoofprint that had marked it that morning. Thaddeus Vance stood in the doorway of the livery stable, one gloved hand braced against the frame, and watched the world go white. He was 54 years old, built like the iron he had spent 3 decades bending broad through the shoulders, thick in the forearms, with a face weathered brown by forge heat and prairie sun. His beard, more silver now than black, was rimed with frost. He had been waiting at the stable for 2 hours, ever since the noon stage should have arrived and hadn't, and he was beginning to understand with the slow dread of a man who had buried one wife already, that a woman might be dying somewhere out there in the white. "She won't come tonight, Thad," said Ezra Coyle, the stable owner, pulling his coat tighter. "No sane driver pushes through a storm like this. She'll be holed up at the Miller Way station safe and warm, and she'll come in tomorrow with the sun." And if the driver pushed on anyway, if he thought he could beat it, Ezra had no answer for that because both men had seen what Wyoming winters did to travelers who gambled and lost. The storm did not care that a man's whole future might be riding somewhere inside it unprotected, and Thad found himself praying in the wordless, half-formed way a man prayed when he had not stepped inside a church in longer than he cared to admit that whatever providence still watched over lonely blacksmiths and their unlikely brides would see fit to spare this one small mercy from the wreckage of the night. Thad had not wanted a mail-order bride. He wanted to say that plainly, if only to himself standing there in the mounting cold. 6 years a widower, and in all that time he had told anyone who asked that he was content. The forge kept his hands busy, his small cabin kept him dry, and a man his age had no business chasing after a second chance at a life that had already given him its one great love and then taken her away with a fever in the space of 9 days. But loneliness, it turned out, was not something a man could out-argue. It settled into a house the way cold settled into iron, and by the second winter alone, Thad had begun talking to his horse, simply to hear a voice that was not his own answering the silence. So he had written the letter. He had done it almost as a dare to himself, half expecting no answer to come back at all. When the reply arrived, careful, precise handwriting, a voice that came through the page as gentle and a little sad, something in his chest had loosened for the first time in years. Her name was Caledonia Blythe. She was 24. She wrote that she had no family left to speak of, that she was accustomed to hard work, and that she hoped if he would have her to build a quiet life somewhere, the wind could not find her past. He had thought that an odd thing to write. He thought of it again now, standing in the doorway with the storm screaming at his back, and felt the first cold thread of worry that had nothing to do with the weather. He had asked around quietly in the weeks after her letters began arriving, not out of suspicion so much as ordinary caution. The same caution any sensible man exercised before inviting a stranger into his home and his name. The answers he'd gotten back from the marriage bureau in the East had been thin, oddly thin for a woman of good character seeking a respectable arrangement. No family listed beyond a sister mentioned once, and never again in later letters. No fixed address before the boarding house she'd written from those final months. A clerk who handled the correspondence had described her in a brief note appended to her file as quiet, capable, and evidently in some haste to leave the city, without elaborating on what haste might mean or what she might be leaving in such a hurry. Thad had read that note 3 times over and decided in the end that a woman's privacy was her own business, and that he had no right to demand explanations from a stranger he had not yet even met. He wondered now, standing in the stable doorway with the storm screaming past him, whether that generosity of judgment had been wisdom or simply the loneliness talking. It was nearly 9 o'clock, the whole town dark and shuddered against the cold, when Ezra's boy came pounding down the frozen street, shouting that there was a wagon coming in from the east road, moving slow, moving wrong. Thad did not wait to hear more. He took the lantern and went out into the storm. He found the wagon a quarter-mile out, listing hard where one wheel had dropped into a drift. The horse standing, head down and trembling in its traces, too exhausted even to fight the cold. The driver, an old man wrapped in 3 coats, was slumped forward, half frozen on the bench alive, but barely able to speak. And huddled in the back, beneath a mound of soaked blankets, so still that for one terrible moment Thad believed he had come too late, was a woman. He said her name, a guess, a prayer, and she stirred. Miss Blythe. Her eyes opened. Even in the lantern light, even half buried in wet wool, and shivering so hard her teeth clicked together, he could see they were a pale striking gray, like the sky just before snow. She looked at him with the particular terror of someone who did not know if the man before her meant to help her or harm her, and something in that look struck Thad harder than the wind at his back. "I'm Thaddeus Vance," he said, keeping his voice as low and even as he could manage over the storm. "You wrote to me. I've come to bring you home." She did not answer. She could not. He realized her lips were blue, her body racked with tremors too violent for speech. He did what needed doing without asking permission, because there was no time left for manners. He lifted her out of the ruined wagon, wrapped her in his own coat over the wet blankets, and carried her the quarter-mile back through the snow, with the wind trying to tear her from his arms the whole way. She weighed almost nothing. He noticed that even through his fear for her, how light she was, how thin beneath the layers of wet cloth, as though she had not eaten a full meal in some time. He noticed, too, the way her hands, even unconscious, stayed curled tight around a bundle she had kept pressed to her chest, the entire ride some shawl or parcel she would not let go of, even in near death. He did not have the leisure to wonder what it was. He simply held her closer against the cold and walked faster. His cabin, when they finally reached it, was the first mercy the night had offered either of them. He had banked the fire high before he left, hoping against hope she would arrive, and now the coals caught fast when he fed them fresh wood, throwing a ruddy, grateful light across the small room. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and the last of the evening stew, and the warmth of it struck him fresh in the doorway, the way it always did after time spent out in a hard wind. A small mercy he had stopped noticing until he had someone beside him to notice it for. He set her down as near the hearth as was safe, stripped away the sodden blankets, and wrapped her instead in the quilt his late wife had made, the one he kept folded at the foot of his bed and rarely touched. It felt right somehow to give it to her now. Sarah would not have minded. Sarah, he thought, would have scolded him for standing there dripping melted snow instead of putting a kettle on. He worked quickly and, without fuss, heated water, found dry stockings, set a pot of broth from the previous night's supper to warming over the flame, all the while glancing back at the woman by the fire, watching color creep slowly back into her face. When at last her shivering eased into something closer to ordinary trembling, and her breathing settled into a rhythm that did not frighten him, he allowed himself to sit down across from her and simply look. She was younger than her letters had made her sound, or perhaps only younger than her circumstances had made her seem, a woman who had learned early to write like someone twice her age, careful and guarded. Her dark hair, drying now in loose waves near the fire, had come half undone from its pins. Her face, even drawn with cold and exhaustion, had a fineness to it, delicate around the eyes and mouth, though there was a hollowness beneath her cheekbones that told him hunger had been an old companion of hers, not a new one. "You're safe," he said when her eyes opened again and found him watching. "Storm caught your wagon on the east road. You're at my place now. There's broth here when you're ready for it, and you needn't be afraid of me." Her voice, when it finally came, was rough from the cold and trembling, despite her clear effort to steady it. "I am sorry to be such trouble, Mr. Vance." "No trouble a body couldn't help," he said. "Wyoming winter doesn't ask permission before it does its worst. I'm only glad we found you when we did." She looked down at the bundle still clutched in her arms. He saw now it was a shawl wrapped tight around something small and square, and her fingers tightened on it, a small unconscious motion, before she seemed to catch herself and loosen her grip, tucking it instead beneath the quilt at her side out of his line of sight. He noticed. He said nothing. They ate in a silence that was at first the ordinary silence of two strangers too tired and too wary to fill the air with talk. But as the broth warmed her and the fire dried the last of the storm from her hair, the silence began to change character, softening at its edges. Thad found himself talking a little about the town, about Ezra's stable, and the widow Kelsey, who ran the mercantile, in the small stone church at the end of the street where the circuit preacher came through once a month if the roads allowed it. He told her because it seemed important that she know it plainly that he did not expect anything from her she was not ready to give. "I know men write for brides expecting a certain kind of arrangement straight off," he said, choosing the words with the same careful attention he gave to shaping hot iron, wanting no rough edges left in them to cut her. "I'm not that kind of man, Miss Blythe. You've had a hard journey and a harder night. Whatever this marriage becomes, it can become it slowly. I've buried one wife already. I'm not in any hurry to rush a second into anything she isn't ready for." She looked up at him then, and for the first time since he had pulled her from the wagon, something in her face eased, not fully, not the deep unguardedness of real trust, but enough that he could see briefly the shape of the woman beneath the exhaustion and the fear. Gratitude, yes, but something else too, something that looked almost like disbelief, as if kindness were a language she had not expected to hear spoken in this house, on this night by this stranger she had crossed half a territory to marry. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You don't know what that means to me." She asked him before the meal was finished what had become of his first wife, and he found himself answering honestly in more detail than he had offered anyone in years. The fever that had taken Sarah in 9 days, the particular silence of a house built for two people suddenly holding only one, the way a man could grow so accustomed to loneliness that he stopped recognizing it as a thing that might be cured. Caledonia listened without interrupting, her gray eyes steady on his face, and when he finished she said only, "Grief like that doesn't leave a person. It only learns to sit quieter if you're patient with it." A sentiment spoken with such quiet, hard-won authority that Thad understood even then, on their very first evening, that she was speaking from experience of her own, though she offered none of the particulars. He did not know, but he understood, watching her hand drift back beneath the quilt to rest against the hidden bundle, that there was a great deal about Caledonia Blythe he did not yet know, and that whatever it was, she had carried it through a blizzard rather than leave it behind. Outside, the wind did not relent. It threw itself against the cabin walls with a fury that made the timbers groan, and twice during their quiet supper, a gust struck the door hard enough that Caledonia flinched, her eyes going to it with an alertness that seemed disproportionate to mere weather. The wariness Thad thought of someone who had learned to fear the sound of doors opening in the night. He banked the fire high before he showed her to the small side room that would be hers. His late wife's sewing room, converted hastily that week into a bedroom with a narrow bed and a washstand. Everything a bachelor blacksmith could think to provide on short notice. He told her to sleep as late as she needed, that the cabin was warm and the doors were sound against the wind, and that he would be just beyond the wall if she needed anything at all. She thanked him again softly, and the door closed between them. Thad sat a long while by the dying fire afterward, listening to the storm and to the quieter sounds beyond the wall, the rustle of blankets, a long, unsteady breath that might have been a woman trying not to weep and trying to be quiet about it. He thought of the bundle she had guarded so fiercely through half-frozen unconsciousness, the shawl she had tucked away from his sight the moment she remembered herself. He thought of her flinching at the wind against the door. He thought of how a woman traveled 2,000 miles into a stranger's house, carrying nothing, it seemed, but the clothes on her back and one small, precious, hidden thing she would not set down even to save her own life. Whatever Caledonia Blythe was running from, Thad understood, sitting there in the failing firelight with the storm still howling outside, she had not stopped running yet. She had simply found for one night a house dark enough and far enough from anywhere that her pursuers might not think to look. He banked the coals, said a quiet word of thanks to whatever Providence had guided him to the east road before the cold finished what the wagon wreck had started, and went to his own bed. But sleep was slow in coming, and when it finally arrived, it was shot through with a strange and persistent unease. The sense, half dream and half instinct, of a door somewhere in the dark being pushed slowly open by a hand that did not belong to him. He woke once in the deep hours before dawn, certain he had heard something. A soft, muffled sound from beyond the wall, almost like the low-hushed lullaby a mother might sing to quiet a restless child. He lay still and listened, and after a long moment decided it must have been the wind, finding some new gap in the timbers to sing through. It did not occur to him, not yet, to wonder whether a woman with no family traveling utterly alone across a blizzard-choked territory to marry a man she had never met had any earthly reason to know a lullaby at all, let alone to sing one low and practiced and full of aching tenderness in the dead of a storm-locked night to a room that held, as far as he knew, no child. That question would come later. For now there was only the wind and the fire settling to embers and the fragile, uncertain peace of two strangers under one roof, each carrying a silence the other could not yet see. The storm broke by mid-morning, and Thad rode into town to see about the wrecked wagon, and to let Ezra know that his passenger had survived the night. He found the old stable owner in an unusually talkative mood full of secondhand rumor gathered from the Stageline's dispatcher, who had wired ahead from 3 towns back with an odd little warning that had traveled faster than the storm itself. Word was a woman answering Caledonia. Blythe's description had left her last posting in something of a hurry, and a man had come through, asking after her. Not 2 days behind the stage offering money for word of where she'd gone. Didn't think much of it myself, Ezra said, shooing a nervous gelding while he talked, not looking up. Woman's got a right to travel where she pleases without some fellow chasing her business. But you ought to know folks are already talking, Thad. Small towns got nothing better to do in a blizzard than talk. Thad rode home, turning the words over in his mind, weighing them against the frightened, gentle woman he had carried through the snow the night before, and found he could make no honest sense of the two pictures side by side. The wanted-sounding fugitive of Ezra's second-hand gossip, and the exhausted young bride who had thanked him over and over for a kindness she seemed genuinely astonished to receive. He decided, riding back through the slush and the thinning gray light, that gossip was a poor foundation to build suspicion on, and that he would judge his wife by what he saw with his own eyes, rather than by what strangers 3 towns back had chosen to whisper about her. It was a decision he would return to many times in the weeks that followed, testing it against every new strangeness he observed, and each time he found himself choosing again and again to give her the patience he had promised, rather than the doubt the rumors seemed to invite. The wedding took place 4 days later, once the storm had blown itself out, and the roads were passable enough for the circuit preacher to make his way through on a borrowed mule. It was a small affair, as such things went in a town the size of theirs. The stone church at the end of the street, a handful of neighbors who had come more out of curiosity than ceremony, and Ezra Coyle standing witness with his hat pressed to his chest. Caledonia wore a plain gray dress that had clearly been mended more than once, and she stood at the altar with her spine so straight and her hands so carefully folded that Thad understood, watching her, that this stillness was a kind of armor. She was holding herself together by main force of will. He had expected nerves. He had not expected the particular quality of her fear, not the ordinary bridal anxiety of a woman entering a new life, but something sharper, something that made her eyes flick toward the church doors every time they opened, as if she were still even here at the altar, listening for footsteps that were not the preacher's. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Thad took her hand cold, despite the stove burning in the corner, and felt her fingers tremble before she steadied them with visible effort. "You've nothing to fear from me," he murmured to her low enough that only she could hear it. "Today or any day after." She looked up at him, and for just a moment the armor slipped. He saw something raw and grateful and almost disbelieving in her face, the look of a woman who had braced for one kind of ceremony and been given instead a kindness she had not thought to hope for. After the ceremony, while the small gathering lingered outside the church to offer their congratulations, the widow Kelsey drew Thad briefly aside, her voice pitched low beneath the general chatter. "She's a good worker, Thad. I'll say that much already. Helped me sort stock not 2 days past without being asked quick hands and quicker mind. But she asked me something odd while we worked. Wanted to know, was there a church nearer than 3 counties east that took in orphan children, kept records private like. Struck me strange, a bride not 2 days married asking after orphan homes. Thought you ought to know in case it means something to you." Thad had thanked her for the observation and said nothing more, filing it away beside the birth certificate. He did not yet know existed one more small stone in a pile that had not yet resolved itself into any recognizable shape. That evening back at the cabin, he kept the promise he had made her that first storm-racked night. He built up the fire, set out a modest supper. He had prepared himself a rabbit stew he'd been tending since morning biscuits. He was not entirely proud of, but had tried his best with. And when the meal was finished and the dishes cleared, he told her plainly that he would sleep in the barn loft that night, and for as many nights after as she needed until she felt at ease enough in this house and in this marriage to ask otherwise. "You're a strange man, Thaddeus Vance," she said, and there was something almost like a smile in it the first he had seen from her. "Most men would not offer that. Most men haven't buried a wife they love past reason," he said simply. "I know something about what it costs a person to trust again. I'd rather earn yours slow and keep it than take it fast and lose it." She was quiet a long moment, studying him with those pale gray eyes, in a way that made him feel not uncomfortable exactly, but seen truly looked at for perhaps the first time since Sarah had died. "Thank you," she said again, the words she seemed to reach for most often, as though gratitude were the only currency she trusted herself to spend freely. "I don't know that I deserve such patience, but I am grateful for it all the same." He thought that an odd thing to say. I don't know that I deserve it, but he let it pass. The way he had let a dozen small strangenesses pass in the 4 days since the blizzard. The way she flinched at sudden sounds, the way she watched the road from the kitchen window longer than any ordinary curiosity required, the way she had, twice now, hummed a low and tender tune under her breath, while mending a shirt, a lullaby's cadence in a house with no child to sing it to. He climbed to the barn loft that night with his mind full of questions he did not yet feel he had the right to ask. It was near midnight, the cabin cold and dark below him, when he came down again, not from any suspicion, only because he had forgotten his good coat by the hearth in the barn loft, for all its shelter held little warmth against a Wyoming night. He moved quietly, not wanting to wake her, and it was that same quiet that let him see through the half-open door of her room what he otherwise never would have. She was asleep, finely curled beneath the quilt, with her dark hair spread loose across the pillow. But even in sleep, one arm was wrapped around the same worn shawl bundle she had guarded through the blizzard, held against her chest, the way a woman might hold a thing she could not bear to lose, even in dreams. The shawl had slipped just slightly in her sleeping stillness. A corner of paper showed at its edge, pale against the dark wool. Thad stood in the doorway a long moment, telling himself to walk away, that whatever she carried was hers to keep private, that a man who had asked for patience from his own conscience owed her the same. But some instinct older than manners kept his feet planted, and before he had fully decided to do it, he had crossed the small room and with the gentlest care his blacksmith's hands were capable of, eased the paper free without disturbing her sleep. He carried it to the kitchen where a single candle still burned low and unfolded it there. It was a birth certificate. The paper was soft with handling creased along the same lines so many times that the folds had gone thin and translucent. The ink, though faded, was still legible enough to read by candlelight, and what it said struck Thad like a hammer blow to the chest. Mother Caledonia Blythe, a son, born just over a year past, in a town whose name meant nothing to him, hundreds of miles to the east. Thad sat down heavily at his own table, the paper trembling slightly in his hand, or perhaps it was his hand that trembled. He could no longer be sure. The candle guttered low, throwing his shadow huge and unsteady across the log walls, and for a long while he simply sat with the document before him, reading the same handful of words over and over, as though repetition might change their meaning, might resolve them into some more comfortable explanation than the one his mind kept circling toward. He thought of the lullaby hummed under her breath. He thought of the practiced, tender way she had spoken that first night of the town's need for someone to help mind children when their mothers were down with illness. A subject she had raised herself unprompted, with a familiarity that had struck him even then as oddly specific for an unmarried woman. He thought of the shawl guarded through a blizzard as though it were the most precious thing she owned. A son, and no husband's name anywhere on the document, no father listed at all. He did not know what to make of it. Could not, in the fog of shock and confusion the discovery had thrown him into, decide whether what he felt was betrayal or pity or some tangled knot of both. She had written to him as an unmarried woman seeking a fresh start. She had let the preacher speak vows over her as though she came to this marriage unencumbered by any life before it. And all the while she had carried hidden against her heart proof of a child he knew nothing about, a child she had apparently left somewhere behind her in that unnamed eastern town. Had she abandoned him? Given him up? Was there some tragedy there? Some grief he could not yet see the shape of? Or had she simply lied? Used him? Used this marriage as a means of escaping a life whose complications she had no wish to carry west with her. Thad folded the certificate back along its worn creases with hands that had gone very still, the shock settling now into something colder and more deliberate. He sat with the question a long while in the cold kitchen, the candle burning down toward its final inch, turning over in his mind every gentle word she had spoken to him in the 4 days since the blizzard, weighing them now against this new and troubling knowledge, searching for some crack in her kindness that might reveal it as calculation rather than character. He found none. Whatever else was true of her, the warmth she had shown him, the careful gratitude, the small, unguarded laugh she had allowed herself over supper the night before, none of it had felt in the moment like performance. It had felt like a woman slowly, cautiously allowing herself to hope. That more than anything else was what stayed his hand from waking her right then and demanding answers he was not yet certain he had the right to demand. He did not wake her. He did not confront her, not that night, not the next morning, not for many mornings after. Instead, he returned the paper to its place inside the shawl before dawn, so carefully that she never knew it had left her side, and he began quietly and without announcing it even to himself to watch. What he saw over the days that followed only deepened the mystery rather than resolving it. Caledonia was, he came to understand, extraordinarily good with children. Not in the vague, sentimental way some women were said to be good with them, but in a manner that spoke of real hard-won practice. When the widow Kelsey's youngest came down with a fever that kept the mercantile shuttered for 2 days, it was Caledonia who walked over unbidden with a poultice she knew how to make from memory, who held the feverish child through a long night with the easy, unthinking competence of someone who had done such things 100 times before. When old Mrs. Abernathy's grandson fell from the smithy fence and split his lip, it was Caledonia who cleaned the wound with a steadiness that made the boy stop crying almost at once, soothed by her low, even voice before he even understood he had been hurt. She sewed, too, in the evening small garments Thad did not immediately understand the purpose of until he saw the tiny scale of them laid across her lap. A baby's gown no larger than his 2 hands, together stitched with a careful, loving attention that no woman sewed into clothing meant for strangers. One afternoon, riding back from the mercantile, Thad passed her standing at the edge of the churchyard in quiet conversation with the circuit preacher, her posture urgent, her hands moving in the particular emphatic way people spoke when the matter under discussion mattered a great deal to them. He did not approach close enough to hear the words, some instinct of tact holding him back, but he saw the preacher nod gravely and press her hand in a gesture that looked from a distance less like ordinary parish comfort and more like a promise being made and accepted. When he asked her that evening carefully what had brought her to the church that day, she told him only that she had been inquiring about the town's arrangements for families in need, an answer plain enough on its face, and yet Thad thought, watching her busy herself unnecessarily with the supper dishes, rather than meet his eyes, not the whole of it either. He said nothing. He told himself he was waiting for the right moment for her to trust him enough to offer the truth herself, rather than have it dragged from her by suspicion. But beneath that patient reasoning ran a colder current of doubt that grew day by day harder to ignore. Who was the father of that child? Where was the boy now, and why this question troubled him most of all? Why had she come 2,000 miles west to marry a stranger, rather than simply raising her son wherever she had born him? The answer, when it came, arrived not from Caledonia's own lips, but from the barrel of a stranger's gun. It was a bright, hard, frozen evening, some 2 weeks into the marriage, when the riders came. Thad heard them before he saw them, the particular rhythm of many horses moving together unhurried, deliberate, the sound of men who did not fear whatever house they were approaching. He stepped out of the forge, hammer still in hand, and watched 6 riders come to a stop in his yard, their leader dismounting with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never in his life been told no and made it stick. He was perhaps 50, silver-templed, dressed in a coat too fine for frontier work, and he carried himself with the particular arrogance of wealth long unchallenged. He introduced himself as Harlan Cross, a landowner from 3 counties east, and said with a courtesy so smooth it felt almost like an insult that he was searching for stolen horses believed to have been driven this way. Thad told him truthfully that no strange horses had come through his land, and offered to let the man's riders look through his stock if it would settle the matter faster. Cross accepted with a small, satisfied smile that did not reach his eyes, and while his men made a show of inspecting the corral, he drew Thad aside out of earshot of the cabin and pressed something folded into his hand. "Not horses, I'm truly after, Mr. Vance," Cross said quietly. "But since we're speaking plainly man to man, you ought to know what manner of woman you've brought into your home." Thad unfolded the paper with a growing sense of dread that had by now become almost familiar to him. It was a wanted poster, the ink cheap and the printing crude, but the likeness beneath the bold black letters was unmistakable, the same pale gray eyes, the same fine, delicate features he had watched across his supper table every night for 2 weeks. Wanted. Caledonia Blythe. Theft of a substantial sum from the estate of Harlan Cross. Reward offered for information leading to her return. "She took near everything I had," Cross said, his voice dropping into something low and almost gentle, a tone that made the accusation land harder for its softness. "Cleaned out an account that wasn't rightly hers to touch and vanished before I could see justice done. I've been 3 months tracking her west. I'd not have guessed she'd found herself a husband along the way. Clever girl, I'll give her that. A married woman draws less suspicion than one traveling alone." Thad stood in the frozen yard with the poster trembling faintly in his grip from cold. He told himself, though he suspected it was not only the cold, and looked past Cross's shoulder to the cabin, where lamplight glowed warm and steady in the kitchen window, where his wife of 2 weeks was at that very moment, most likely humming some tender, unexplained lullaby over a supper she had prepared for a man she had married under a name that might, for all he now knew, not even be entirely her own. A wanted thief. A hidden child with no father's name on his birth certificate. A shawl guarded through a blizzard as though it held the last thing on earth worth saving. Thad folded the poster along its crease the way he had folded the birth certificate 2 weeks before and said nothing to Harlan Cross that would betray the storm now breaking loose behind his own ribs. "I'll bear it in mind," he said, and his voice to his own surprise came out steady. "See that you do," Cross said, mounting his horse with the unhurried ease of a man who had never once in his life doubted that he would eventually get what he wanted. "I'd hate for a decent man like yourself to come to harm protecting something that was never rightfully his to protect. I mean to have what's mine back, Mr. Vance, one way or another. Better it come easy for everyone's sake. And if I told you I don't believe a word of what's printed on that poster." Cross paused, one boot already in the stirrup, and looked back at Thad with an expression that had for just a moment lost its polished courtesy entirely. "Then I'd say you're a trusting man or a foolish one, and out here those two things have a way of getting a fellow killed before winter's through. Good evening to you, Mr. Vance. Give my regards to your bride." He rode off with his men into the gathering dark, and Thad stood alone in the yard, a long while after the sound of hooves had faded, the wanted poster still folded in his fist, watching the cabin's lamplight and feeling for the first time since Sarah's death that the fragile peace he had begun building for himself might already be beyond his power to protect. But as he watched Cross and his riders turn their horses back toward the frozen road disappearing into the deepening blue dusk, Thad understood that whatever peace he had begun carefully, cautiously to build in his own house over these past 2 weeks had just been shattered beyond any simple mending, and that the woman waiting for him by the fire was not merely keeping a secret. She was running from one that might yet cost them both everything. Thad did not confront her that night, nor the next, nor the one after that. He told himself, lying awake in the barn loft with the wanted poster folded into the lining of his coat, that he was waiting for proof beyond a stranger's word before he let suspicion undo whatever fragile thing had begun growing between them. But the truer reason, the one he was slower to admit even to himself, was simpler and harder to forgive. He did not want it to be true. He had watched Caledonia Blythe move through his house and his town for 2 weeks, watched her tend a feverish child through the night without being asked, watched her mend a stranger's torn coat without expectation of thanks, watched her work harder in a single day than most men he'd known worked in 3, and none of it fit the shape of the woman Harlan Cross had described. And yet, the poster existed. The birth certificate existed. A man did not simply choose which truths to believe and discard the rest, however much he might wish to. So he watched and he waited, and in the watching and waiting, something he had not planned for began to happen. Regardless of his caution, he fell in love with her. It came upon him the way weather did on the plains, not in a single dramatic instant, but in a long, gradual accumulation of small things, until one day he looked up and realized the whole sky had changed. It was in the way she hummed while she worked, unaware she was doing it that same tender lullaby cadence he had first heard through her bedroom wall. It was in the careful, unshowy competence with which she ran his household, mending what needed mending, stretching a lean larder into meals that tasted like abundance, keeping the cabin so clean and so warm that he found himself for the first time in 6 years reluctant to leave it in the mornings. It was in the quiet evenings when they sat on either side of the fire, she with her sewing and he with a harness needing repair, and really talked about small things at first, the weather and the town and the particular stubbornness of his mare, and then slowly about larger things, her love of reading, cut short by circumstances she never named. His grief for Sarah, which Caledonia listened to, not with the awkward discomfort most people showed around a widower's sorrow, but with a steady, patient tenderness that made him feel for the first time since the fever took his first wife, that his grief was not a burden he carried alone. The town, too, had begun to take notice of the change in them both. Old Mrs. Abernathy remarked more than once within Thad's hearing that she had not seen him stand so straight nor smile so freely since before Sarah's passing, and the widow Kelsey took to saving the best cuts of ribbon for Caledonia's visits to the mercantile. A small, unspoken gesture of welcome that meant more to a woman with no family of her own than the widow likely realized. Even Ezra Gruff and sparing with sentiment, as he generally was allowed one evening over cards, that Thad's new bride had done more good for the man's disposition in 3 weeks than 6 years of solitary living ever had. She too seemed to be changing in his presence, softening by degrees, the wariness in her eyes giving ground slowly to something warmer. She laughed more easily as the days passed, a real laugh surprised out of her by some small joke of his, quickly stifled, as though she distrusted her own capacity for lightness, but unable in the moment to fully suppress it. She began without his asking to sit closer to him by the fire in the evenings. She began once or twice to reach for his hand when the day's talk turned to something that frightened her, and he understood, feeling her cold fingers close around his rough, scarred palm, that whatever else was true about her, this trust at least was real. He tended his forge each day with new energy, the rhythmic ring of hammer on anvil, a kind of prayer he had not known he was praying, and found himself more than once glancing up toward the cabin window, where she sometimes stood watching him work, her expression unguarded in a way it never was when she knew herself observed. There came an afternoon when she brought his midday meal out to the forge herself rather than waiting for him inside, and stayed after to watch him work, curious in a way that pleased him more than he let show. He put a hammer in her hand, half in jest, and showed her how to strike a length of heated iron square on the anvil's face. And though her first efforts sent the metal skittering sideways twice before she found the rhythm of it, by the fifth strike she had it, and the sound of her small, surprised laugh echoing off the forge walls. When she finally landed, the blow clean was a sound he found himself hoping to hear again. It was during that same lesson that a spark leapt wild from the coals and caught the loose edge of her sleeve, and Thad, moving faster than thought, closed the distance between them and smothered the ember with his bare palm before it could do more than singe the cloth, his heart hammering harder from the fright of it than from any exertion of the day's work. She had gone very still in the circle of his arms afterward, her breath quick, her eyes searching his face with an expression that was no longer merely gratitude. And for a long moment, neither of them moved a step back, the forge fire crackling and the horses shifting in their stalls, the only sounds in a silence that had, without either of them quite deciding it, become something else entirely. "You needn't have risked your hand for my sleeve," she said finally, softer than he'd ever heard her. "I'd risk considerably more than a hand," he said, "before I'd let harm come to you while I was standing close enough to stop it." She had not answered, that only looked at him a moment longer, with something bright and unguarded in her pale gray eyes, before stepping back and returning with visibly unsteady hands to the meal she had brought him. There was an evening not long before that one when a late-season squall kept them both indoors for the better part of 2 days, and rather than the restlessness Thad half expected from being housebound so long, the enforced closeness had drawn something quieter and more companionable out of them both. They had spent long hours simply talking Caledonia, asking him with real curiosity to teach her the names of the tools hung along his workshop wall, listening with evident delight as he explained the particular temperament of a good anvil, the patience required to read the color of heated iron correctly, And Thad in turn asking her about the books she loved, watching her face transform briefly untroubled as she described novels she had read years before and half-forgotten characters she still apparently thought of like old friends. It was during one of those quiet afternoons that she had fallen asleep unplanned, with her head resting against his shoulder while the snow ticked softly against the window pane, and Thad had sat very still for the better part of an hour, rather than risk waking her memorizing without quite admitting to himself that was what he was doing, the exact weight and warmth of her against his side. It was on an evening some 3 weeks into their marriage, with a light snow falling soft and windless outside the cabin windows, that the careful distance between them finally dissolved. They had eaten supper together as they always did, and afterward, rather than retreating to her sewing and his harness work, Caledonia had simply remained where she was, close beside him on the bench near the fire, her hands still in her lap, watching the flames with an expression he had not seen on her before. Not fear, not wariness, but a kind of open, unguarded sorrow that made his chest ache to see it. "I keep thinking," she said quietly, not looking at him, "that tomorrow might not come the way we expect it to, that a person ought not to wait for the perfect moment to say the true things, because the perfect moment has a way of never arriving at all. What true thing is it you want to say?" She was quiet a long moment, and when she finally turned to look at him, her pale gray eyes were bright with something that might have been tears held carefully in check. "That I did not come west looking for safety, Thaddeus. I came looking for a man who might, if I was very fortunate, come to see me as someone worth loving. I did not think I would find him. I did not think, given everything, that I deserved to find him. But I believe I have, and I find I cannot go on pretending otherwise, whatever tomorrow may bring." He set aside the harness leather in his hands and turned fully toward her, and in the firelight, with the snow falling soft and silent beyond the windows, he reached up and for the first time since their wedding day, touched her face, the gentlest brush of his rough fingers against her cheek, asking a question he did not trust himself to speak aloud. She answered it by leaning into his hand, closing her eyes, and letting out a long, unsteady breath that sounded like something held too tightly for too long, finally allowed to loosen. "I want tonight," she whispered, "to belong to someone who chooses me, truly chooses me, knowing me as I am, not as I might wish to appear." "You have that already," he said, low and rough, with an emotion he made no effort to hide. "Whatever else is true, Caledonia, whatever you haven't told me yet, I choose you. I've chosen you every day since I pulled you out of that wagon, and I'll go on choosing you tomorrow and the day after that for as long as you'll let me." What passed between them after that was not something the story needs to dwell upon in detail, only to say that it was slow and it was tender and it was carried out with the particular reverence of two people who had each in their own separate ways given up hoping for such gentleness and found it unlooked for in each other. The fire burned low, the snow kept falling outside, hushed and steady, and inside the small cabin, two lonely lives quietly became one. Morning came gray and soft, the snow still falling in fine, unhurried flakes against the window. Thad woke to find Caledonia already awake beside him, propped on one elbow, watching him with an expression he could not immediately name tenderness. Yes, but shadowed by something heavier. Something that looked, he realized, with a fresh chill, like the gathering of courage before a confession. "There is something I must tell you," she said before he had even fully surfaced from sleep. "I should have told you before last night. I told myself I would, and then I let myself have this instead, because I was selfish and because I wanted just once to be loved before I was judged. I am sorry for that." Thad sat up slowly, the warmth of the previous night curdling into a cold, familiar dread. "Tell me now." She sat up as well, drawing the quilt around herself, and for a long moment simply looked at her own hands as though gathering the strength to speak. "A man came to see you 2 weeks ago," she said. "Harlan Cross. I saw his riders from the kitchen window. I did not need to hear what he told you to know, what it was. I have been waiting for that conversation to happen since before we married, dreading it, praying it would somehow never come. You knew he was hunting you. I have known for over a year." Her voice when it came was steady, but there was a rawness beneath the steadiness that told him the calm was costing her a great deal to maintain. "He is not wrong, Thaddeus. Not entirely. I did take money from him. A great deal of money. I will not insult you by pretending otherwise, not after everything you have given me these past weeks." Something in Thad's chest, some fragile structure he had been building without fully realizing it, cracked audibly at those words. "Why?" "I cannot tell you why, not yet. I am asking you to trust me a little longer, though I know I have no right to ask anything of you at all after what I've just admitted." She looked up, and her eyes, bright with unshed tears, held his with a desperate, pleading steadiness. "If you must hand me over to him, Thaddeus, I will not run. I will not fight you. But I beg you, if it comes to that, if there is no other way, do not let him take me alive. Shoot me yourself here in this house before you let that man carry me back to wherever he intends to take me." The words landed like a physical blow, driving the breath from him. Caledonia. "I mean it." Her voice cracked finally, the careful composure giving way to something raw and frightened and utterly sincere. "You do not understand what he is capable of. I would rather die in this house, in this bed, having known these 3 weeks of kindness, than go back to what waits for me if he takes me. Please, promise me that much, even if you can promise me nothing else." Thad did not promise. He could not yet not, with his mind still reeling from the confession and the confession's terrible coda both at once. But he took her hands in his, cold and trembling, despite the warmth of the quilt around them, and held them steady, and understood in that moment that whatever came next, whatever truth still lay hidden beneath the birth certificate and the wanted poster and the desperate plea for a mercy killing rather than capture, he was not going to hand this woman over to anyone without a fight that would cost him everything he had. "You said you cannot tell me why yet," he said, when he trusted his voice enough to speak again. "Can you tell me if it was worth it? Whatever you took, whatever risk you ran taking, was it worth what it's cost you to carry this alone?" She considered the question with a gravity that told him she had asked it of herself many times already, in many long nights before this one. "Every dollar of it," she said finally. "I would do it again tomorrow, knowing everything it has cost and everything it may yet cost. Some things are worth more than a person's own safety, Thaddeus. I hope one day you'll understand why I believe that so completely. I hope, too, that when you do understand, you won't think less of me for the deception it required. I could never think less of a woman brave enough to risk everything for something she believed worth protecting," he said. "Whatever it is, I mean that." She looked at him a long moment, something fragile and hopeful moving behind her eyes, before the weight of her unfinished confession seemed to settle over her again, and she looked away toward the fire instead, unable for now to say more. "I won't let him take you," he said instead, which was not the promise she had asked for, but was, he thought, the truer one. "Whatever you've done, whatever reason drove you to it, I've watched you for 3 weeks, Caledonia. I've watched how you are with a frightened child, with a stranger's wound, with an old widower's grief. I don't believe you're the woman that poster describes. I think there's a piece of this I'm not seeing yet, and I mean to find it before I let anyone take you from this house." She wept then. Finally, the tears she had been holding back through her whole careful confession breaking loose all at once, and he held her through it, saying nothing more, understanding that some grief could not be reasoned away, only weathered together. But even as he held her, even as he felt the fierce protective certainty settling into his chest that he would defend this woman against Harlan Cross or the devil himself if it came to that, Thad could not fully silence the cold, quiet voice at the back of his mind that kept circling back to the birth certificate folded inside her shawl, the child she had never once mentioned, not even now, not even in a confession that had laid bare so much else. She had told him about the theft. She had told him she feared Harlan Cross enough to beg for death over capture. But of the son whose birth certificate she carried against her heart through blizzard and marriage vow alike, she had said even now not a single word. Whatever truth remained buried beneath everything she had confessed this morning, Thad understood with a growing unease that it was not yet fully unearthed, and that the next revelation, whenever it came, was likely to be the one that mattered most of all. The 8 days between Cross's first visit and his second passed for Thad in a state of watchful, low-grade dread that he did his best to keep hidden from his wife. Though he suspected from the careful way she had taken to watching the road herself in the mornings that she felt the same gathering pressure he did, the sense of a storm building somewhere just beyond the horizon, even on days when the sky itself stayed clear. He took to keeping his rifle nearer the door than had been his habit. He noticed Caledonia doing much the same with a kitchen knife she began carrying half concealed in the pocket of her apron. Neither of them spoke of it directly. It was simply understood between them in the particular unspoken language two people developed when they had come, without quite realizing it, to genuinely need each other's safety as much as their own. Harlan Cross returned 8 days later, and this time he did not come alone with a handful of riders pretending to search for stolen horses. He came with the county sheriff himself, a heavy-set man named Del Pruitt, whose badge Thad would later learn had been bought and paid for as thoroughly as any of Cross's land or cattle. They arrived at dawn while the frost still lay thick and silver across the yard, and there was no pretense this time, no courteous fiction about missing livestock. Pruitt dismounted with a warrant in hand, real or forged. Thad had no way to know, in the moment, only that it bore an official seal and a signature that silenced whatever protest he might have made, and announced in the flat-board tone of a man long accustomed to enforcing the will of whoever paid him best that Caledonia Vance-born Blythe was under arrest for grand theft. Caleb's small gown, half-finished on Caledonia's sewing basket by the hearth, caught the sheriff's eye as he crossed the threshold, and he lifted it between two fingers with a slow, deliberate curiosity that made Thad's stomach turn even before the man spoke. "Curious thing for a childless bride to be stitching," Pruitt said, letting the tiny garment fall back into the basket. "Mr. Cross did mention there might be more to this arrest than a simple matter of missing funds." Thad stepped between the sheriff and his wife with his blacksmith shoulders squared and his voice pitched low and hard. "You'll want to think carefully before you lay a hand on her, Sheriff. And you'll want to think carefully before you obstruct a lawful arrest, Mr. Vance," Pruitt said, unbothered. "Unless you'd care to share a cell with her." It was Harlan Cross standing back near his horse, with the same smooth, satisfied smile he had worn during his first visit, who gave the order that followed a search of the cabin top to bottom for the money he claimed Caledonia had stolen. Thad watched helpless and furious in equal measure as Pruitt's men tore through his home with a carelessness that felt less like investigation and more like punishment. Mattresses, overturned cabinets emptied onto the floor. The small collection of dishes that had been Sarah's shattered in a heap by a deputy who did not so much as glance down at what he'd broken. They found no money. Of course they found no money because as Thad was beginning in the cold clarity of his rage to suspect there had never been any money in this house to find. But the search yielded something else, something that struck Thad harder than any accusation Cross had leveled. Yet tucked in a drawer beneath Caledonia's few belongings, the deputies found a small stack of letters, and Cross going through them himself with the proprietary confidence of a man who believed he already knew every answer, went very still when he reached the last one. "Well," he said softly, and something in his voice had changed, gone cold and dangerous, in a way it had not been before. "It seems there's rather more to this story than a simple theft after all." He turned to face Caledonia, who stood in the wreckage of the cabin with Thad's arm still braced protectively in front of her face gone pale and rigid with a fear that was Thad now understood. Not fear of arrest at all, but fear of exposure. Fear of some deeper truth Cross had just laid his hand upon. "Tell your husband," Cross said almost gently, almost kindly, in a tone that made the cruelty beneath it land harder for the softness of its delivery. "Tell him about your sister." The word landed in the ruined cabin like a struck match in dry grass. "I don't have a sister," Caledonia said, but her voice shook on the lie, and Thad, standing close enough to feel the tremor running through her, understood in that instant that it was a lie, that whatever truth Cross was circling, now it was the truth, the real one. The one that had been buried beneath every layer of secret he had already uncovered. "Don't you?" Cross said. "Strange then that I have letters here addressed to a Caledonia Blythe from a Rosalind Blythe, written in a hand near identical to your own, discussing a child neither of you could publicly claim as your own, without inviting questions neither of you could afford to answer. Strange, too, that Rosalind Blythe worked in my household for the better part of 2 years before her death, and that the fortune you're accused of stealing from me is in fact precisely the sum I owed her when I dismissed her from my service." "You didn't dismiss her," Caledonia said, and now her voice had changed too, the fear giving way to something harder, something furious and grieving at once. "You used her. You used her for 2 years, and then you cast her aside when she was carrying a child you refused to acknowledge, and when she came to you asking only for what was rightfully hers to raise that child on you, had her thrown off your land with nothing. She died within the year, Harlan. She died of a fever she might have survived if she'd had money enough for a doctor. Money that was hers, that you owed her, that you kept for yourself out of spite because she dared to ask for it." The cabin had gone utterly silent. Even Sheriff Pruitt, Thad noticed, had gone still, his earlier boredom replaced by something that looked for the first time like genuine unease. "She left me her son," Caledonia said, and now the tears she had been holding back through the whole confrontation broke loose, sliding down her face, even as her voice remained fierce and unbroken. Her son Harlan, not mine. I have never given birth to a child in my life. But my sister, my twin sister, so alike to me that strangers could never tell us apart, died knowing her boy would have no protection in this world unless someone stepped forward to claim him as her own, before you or your lawyers found some way to take him too, the way you took everything else that was ever hers. So I forged the papers. I named myself as his mother because a dead woman's child with no legal guardian is a child anyone with money and lawyers can claim, and I could not let that happen to my sister's son. I did not steal your fortune, Harlan Cross. I took what you already owed a dying woman, and I used every dollar of it to hide her child somewhere. You would never think to look, and then I came 2,000 miles west and married a stranger so that you would spend your money and your men chasing me instead of ever thinking to look for a baby boy in a church you've never heard of. She wrote to me every week those 2 years. Caledonia went on, unable to stop now that the truth had finally broken free, her voice shaking with a grief she had clearly carried alone far too long. Every week telling me how kind you were, said to be by people who'd never even met you, only heard of you. And every week I wrote back begging her to leave your household to come stay with me instead. And every week she told me she couldn't, that she loved you, Harlan. God help her. She actually believed you loved her too. I watched my sister die, still defending you, still making excuses for you. And I have spent every day since promising myself I would not let her son grow up anywhere near a man capable of what you did to his mother. The silence that followed was absolute. Thad stood frozen, the full architecture of the past month collapsing and rebuilding itself in his mind. All at once, the birth certificate with no father's name. Because there was no father to name, only a dead sister's memory, preserved in forged ink. The lullaby hummed under her breath for a child she had left safely hidden, not a child she had abandoned. The uncanny skill with infants that had struck him as strange in an unmarried woman because she had spent months caring for her dying sister's son before ever setting out west. The desperate plea to be shot rather than captured, not out of cowardice, but because she understood better than anyone in that ruined cabin exactly what kind of man Harlan Cross truly was, and exactly what he was capable of doing to a woman who stood between him and whatever he wanted. She had never come west looking for love at all, not truly, not at first. She had come west as a decoy, a sacrifice, a woman willing to vanish into a stranger's marriage and draw a dangerous man's pursuit onto herself, so that an orphaned infant innocent of all of it might grow up safe and unclaimed in some distant church nursery, never knowing how close he had come to becoming Harlan Cross's property. That's a fine story, Cross said into the silence, though something in his composure had cracked some crack of genuine fury showing through the smooth mask he usually wore. A fine story, and not one word of it changes the fact that the money is legally mine, that the boy's guardianship is a matter for courts to decide, not grieving sisters with forged documents, and that you, Mrs. Vance, are still under arrest. On what charge? The voice that cut through the cabin was Thad's own, low and hard, and carrying for the first time in this whole terrible confrontation the full weight of the fury he had been holding in check. You've just heard in front of a sheriff and 2 deputies that the money you claim was stolen was owed to a woman you used and discarded money you withheld from her dying wish to provide for her own son. That's not theft, Cross. That's a debt you never paid, finally collected by the only family that dying woman had left to collect it. I don't imagine that's a story you'll want repeated too widely, not with half the county already whispering about how a rich man's household girl came to an early grave the same year he dismissed her penniless. Something shifted in Cross's face, the first true flicker of uncertainty Thad had seen from him, and in that flicker Thad understood he had found without quite meaning to the beginning of a weapon he could use. But it was not enough, not yet, not against a man who owned the sheriff outright. Pruitt, recovering his composure faster than Cross did, stepped forward and took hold of Caledonia's arm, regardless of everything that had just been said, muttering something about the courts sorting the legalities, and it was only Thad's hand closing hard around the sheriff's wrist, and the low, dangerous promise in his voice that followed that bought them even a few more minutes' delay. "You'll not take her out of this house today," Thad said. "Not without more men than you brought, and not without every neighbor in this town hearing exactly why a rich man's debt to a dead woman is being dressed up as a crime committed by her grieving sister. I've lived in this county 11 years, Sheriff. I've shot half the horses your deputies are riding right now. You think hard about whose word this town is going to believe come Sunday when the whole story's told from the church steps instead of from a warrant Harlan Cross paid to have written. It was not a victory. Pruitt still arrested Thad himself before the morning was through on a charge of obstruction that would not survive close scrutiny but served for the moment to remove him from the fight entirely. The cabin was left ransacked, the fire banked and dying, and Caledonia was taken under guard to await what Cross assured her, with a final chilling smile, would be a very private conversation once her husband was safely out of the way. But as the deputies led Thad off toward town in irons, he caught one last look at his wife's face, across the ruined yard, and what he saw there was not despair, not surrender, but something fiercer, something calculating, something that told him even in chains, even facing whatever cruelty Harlan Cross intended for her, that Caledonia Blythe Vance had not yet finished fighting. Whatever came next, Thad understood watching her disappear behind Cross's riders into the cold morning light. She did not intend to go down without taking every last one of her enemies down with her. Locked behind iron bars that afternoon, stripped of every tool a blacksmith's hands might otherwise have used to force a different outcome, Thad found himself turning over every detail of the past month with the same patient, exacting attention he gave to a difficult piece of ironwork, searching in the darkness of that cell for the one weak point in Harlan Cross's armor that might yet be worked loose. He thought of the fine coat, the easy arrogance the sheriff so plainly on his payroll that even a stranger could see it within a single conversation. He thought, too, of the crack he had glimpsed in Cross's composure back in the ruined cabin, the flicker of genuine alarm when Thad had spoken aloud the possibility of the county learning exactly how Rosalind Blythe had died, and why. A man like Cross did not fear the law, not when he owned the men meant to enforce it. But he feared Thad suspected something the law could not touch nearly so easily. The good opinion of the very county whose land and cattle and easy deference had built his fortune in the first place. It was a thin thread to pull on, but Thad had built a life out of shaping stubborn material with patience and the right kind of pressure applied in exactly the right place. And he did not intend to stop now merely because the material in question was a man's reputation rather than a bar of iron. They held Thad in the county jail for 2 days before Ezra Coyle and half the town's business owners raised enough noise about an obstruction charge with no real evidence behind it that Pruitt had no choice but to release him, muttering threats about further charges that never materialized. 2 days was not long by the measure of a calendar, but it felt to Thad like the longest span of his life, every hour spent pacing a 6-foot cell and imagining in ever-darkening detail what Harlan Cross might be doing to his wife in whatever private place he had taken her. He emerged from the jailhouse into a bitter, clear afternoon with a fury in him that had gone past heat and settled into something colder and more purposeful, the particular calm of a man who has stopped asking whether he will fight and started planning how. He went first to the forge, not to work, but to arm himself with the tools of a trade that had over 3 decades made him stronger than most men half his age. He went next to Ezra and to the widow Kelsey and to old Mrs. Abernathy and to every soul in that small town who had over the past weeks come to know Caledonia Vance, not as a wanted poster's flat description, but as the woman who had sat up all night nursing a feverish child or cleaned a boy's split lip with a gentleness that asked nothing in return. What he found gathering that afternoon in the fading light was not merely sympathy but genuine outrage. A town that had watched Harlan Cross's men tear through a neighbor's home on a warrant few of them believed was honestly earned, and that had in the 2 days since begun quietly comparing notes about Sheriff Pruitt's sudden new prosperity, his unexplained trips to Cross's ranch, the fine new saddle he'd purchased on a lawman's modest salary. It was Ezra who knew or thought he knew where Cross was likely holding her, a line shack on the edge of Cross's own land, isolated enough that no casual traveler would stumble across it, close enough to town that Cross could ride back and forth without raising undue suspicion. It was a guess, not a certainty, but it was the only lead they had, and as dusk settled cold and purple over the frozen plains, Thad rode out with 6 men behind him. Ezra, 2 of the widow's grown sons, and 3 others who had simply decided without needing much persuading that a wrong was being done in their county and that they intended to help right it. The ride out took the better part of 2 hours, the 7 of them moving single file across snow-crusted ground, silvered by a thin, indifferent moon, each man alone with his own private dread of what they might or might not find at the end of it. Thad kept his mind fixed on small, steadying things, the rhythm of his horse's breath, the cold biting through his gloves, the particular weight of the hammer he had slung at his belt in place of a gun he did not own and had never needed until tonight. Because the alternative, the wide-open contemplation of what 2 days in Harlan Cross's custody might have done to his wife, was more than he could carry and still ride straight. They found the line shack a little after full dark, a single window glowing weak and yellow against the surrounding black, two horses tied outside, that Thad recognized at once as belonging to Cross and one of his hired men. What happened next unfolded fast in the particular blur of violence that always seemed afterward both longer and shorter than it had actually been. Thad went through the door first, shoulder first, the old iron hinges giving way easier than he expected, and found Caledonia bound to a chair in the single-room center. Her face bruised along one cheekbone, but her chin lifted, her eyes blazing with a fury that told him, even in that first desperate glance, that whatever cruelty Cross had inflicted on her these 2 days, he had not broken her. Cross's hired man went for a pistol on the table, and Thad was on him before the weapon cleared its holster, the strength of 30 years at the anvil closing around the man's wrist and driving him bodily into the shack's rough log wall, hard enough to end the fight before it properly began. Cross himself cornered and suddenly visibly aware that his money and his badge-owning sheriff were both a long way off, made a desperate scramble for the door, only to find Ezra and the widow's sons blocking it, grim-faced and entirely unmoved by his sudden offers of payment for their silence. The hired man Thad had driven into the wall slid to the floor half-conscious, and outside the widow's sons had the second horse's rider face down in the snow before he'd managed more than a startled shout. The whole violent business start to finish had taken perhaps 90 seconds, though it would live far longer than that. In Thad's memory, the particular terror of seeing his wife bound and bruised, the pure animal relief of knowing the instant he crossed the threshold that he had arrived in time. It was Thad who cut Caledonia free, his hands trembling now with an aftermath of fear he had held in check through the fight itself. And it was Caledonia who, once freed, walked calmly across the small room to where Harlan Cross stood pinned against the wall by three angry ranch hands, and looked at him with a steadiness that seemed in that moment more frightening to the man than any of the violence around him. "You are going to answer for my sister," she said quiet and clear. "Not to me, to a court and to a judge who has not been bought, and to a town that has spent 2 days learning exactly what kind of man you are. I want you to understand that before tonight is finished." What followed over the days after Cross's capture was not so simple or so swift as a single dramatic confrontation might suggest, but it moved once begun with a momentum that surprised even Thad. The territorial marshal summoned from the county seat, once word of a corrupt local sheriff reached ears higher up the chain than Pruitt's, arrived within the week to conduct an investigation that Pruitt could not survive the fine new saddle. The unexplained deposits the testimony of no fewer than 4 other households who had over the years suffered similar treatment at Cross's hands and Pruitt's convenient blindness to it. One of Rosalind Blythe's former fellow servants, tracked down through Caledonia's careful memory of names half mentioned in old letters, came forward to testify to the circumstances of her dismissal and death, corroborating in devastating detail everything Caledonia had said in the ruined cabin that terrible morning. The hearing itself stretched across 3 long days in the county seat. Days Thad spent seated beside Caledonia on a hard wooden bench, her hand gripped tight in his beneath the table, while lawyers argued over documents and testimony that would decide the whole shape of the rest of their lives. Cross's own attorneys fought hard, painting Caledonia as a scheming opportunist who had used a dead woman's misfortune to justify plain theft. And there were hours listening to the case laid out so coldly and so cleverly against her when Thad felt the old fear return in full force. The fear that money and polish and practiced argument might yet triumph over a truth that had no lawyer of its own to speak for it. But the marshal's investigation had been thorough, and the servant girl's testimony, delivered in a small, steady voice that trembled only when she described the day Rosalind Blythe had been turned out into the cold, carried a weight no amount of courtroom polish could fully counter. Harlan Cross was charged eventually not merely with the fraudulent warrant he had procured against Caledonia, but with a wider pattern of financial abuse against former employees that the marshal's investigation, once properly begun, proved distressingly easy to uncover. Justice, when it finally arrived slower than Thad would have liked, and imperfect in the way that justice delivered by fallible men in overworked courts so often was. But it arrived, and Caledonia Vance walked free from every charge that had ever been laid against her. Her name cleared not by any lawyer's clever argument, but by the plain, unanswerable truth of what had actually happened to her sister. Thad brought her home from the marshal's hearing on a bright, cold afternoon in early spring, the first true thaw of the season, softening the hardest edges of the winter that had nearly broken them both. And as they rode together back toward the small cabin that had, in the space of a few violent, transformative months, become something neither of them had expected to find again, a true home built on hard-won trust rather than convenient arrangement, Caledonia turned to him with an expression that mixed relief and a fresh, urgent hope in equal measure. "There is one more thing," she said, "that I need from you now more than anything else in this world." Thad already knew before she finished the sentence what she meant to ask. "Then let's go get him," he said. "Let's go bring your sister's boy home." The church stood 3 days' ride to the south, a small, whitewashed building at the edge of a farming settlement where Caledonia had months before entrusted her sister's infant son to the care of a gentle old pastor and his wife, paying them from Rosalind's recovered inheritance to keep the boy safe and asking nothing more of them than silence and patience until she could return. They rode into the settlement on a morning bright with the particular clean, hopeful light that only came after a long winter had finally truly broken the fields around them, showing the first faint green haze of new growth, the air carrying a softness that had nothing left of the blizzard's cruelty in it. The pastor's wife met them at the door with tears already gathering in her eyes, having clearly understood from the letter Caledonia had sent ahead exactly what this visit meant. She had kept the boy, she told them, over cups of tea neither Thad nor Caledonia could bring themselves to drink, for the trembling anticipation in the room exactly as promised, safe, well-fed, sung to sleep each night. Though she confessed she had wondered more than once through the long winter months whether the young woman who had left him in her care would ever be able to return for him at all, given how frightened and hunted she had seemed on the single occasion they had met. Caleb Rosalind's own quiet wish, recorded in one of the letters Cross's deputies had found, was a sturdy, dark-haired child of some 16 months, now old enough to walk with a determined, wobbling gait, old enough to have opinions about strangers that he was not shy about expressing. Caledonia had told Thad once in the quiet weeks before this journey that her sister had chosen the name deliberately, wanting something strong and simple, a name that would not draw unwanted attention, nor mark the boy as belonging to any particular family line that Cross's lawyers might later think to trace. It was, Thad thought, one more small proof of how carefully, how lovingly a dying woman had planned for a future she would never live to see. When the pastor's wife brought him out into the yard and set him down, he took one look at the tall, broad-shouldered, unfamiliar man standing beside his aunt and retreated immediately behind the woman's skirts, peering out with wide, wary eyes that reminded Thad with a sudden ache of the same wariness he had first seen in Caledonia's own gaze that stormy night so many months before. Thad did not rush him. He had learned over a lifetime of gentling, skittish horses and more recently of earning a frightened woman's trust, one patient day at a time. That trust could not be commanded, only offered and allowed to grow at its own pace. He crouched down slowly in the yard, bringing himself to the boy's height, and simply waited, his arms open but not reaching, his face carefully calm. "You don't have to come to me today," he said quietly, more for the boy's comfort than any expectation of being understood. "You take whatever time you need. I've got nothing but time to give you now, and I mean to keep giving it for as long as you'll have me." It was Caledonia kneeling beside him who spoke the boy's name, softly coaxing, and it was some combination of her familiar voice and Thad's patient, unthreatening stillness that finally overcame the boy's wariness. He took one small, uncertain step from behind the pastor's wife's skirts, then another, his eyes never leaving Thad's face until at last, in a small burst of a toddler's sudden decisive courage, he crossed the remaining distance at a run and threw himself into the waiting circle of Thad's open arms. "Papa," the boy said, a word he had likely learned generically from some story or song, rather than any memory of a father he had never known, but a word that struck Thad with such force that he found himself for the first time since Sarah's death, weeping openly and without shame in front of witnesses, his big arms wrapped protectively around a child who was not his blood, but who felt in that single embrace more fully his own than anything he had dared to hope for in 6 long years of solitude. Caledonia watched them both with tears streaming freely down her own face, one hand resting. Thad noticed as he looked up gently against her own middle, in a gesture he had seen enough women make to understand its meaning, even before she confirmed it with words that evening. "I'm carrying our child," she told him once Caleb had been settled to sleep in the pastor's spare room, and the two of them sat together on the small church porch, beneath a sky finally gloriously clear of storm clouds. "I wasn't certain until we left for the hearing. I didn't want to tell you until I knew, and until I knew too that we would have a life together worth bringing a child into." Thad took her hand, the same hand he had first taken cold and trembling at their wedding altar, and found it steady, now warm, sure of itself in a way it had not been that first frightened day. "We have that life," he said. "Whatever else this past year has cost us both, we've built something worth keeping. I mean to spend the rest of my days making certain of it." Those first weeks of ordinary life together, unshadowed at last by warrants or wanted posters, or the fear of hoofbeats in the yard, felt to Thad like a kind of quiet miracle he had to keep reminding himself was real. He rebuilt the sewing room properly into a boy's bedroom, working late into several evenings by lamplight to fashion a small bed frame from timber he'd been saving for years without knowing what he was saving it for. Caledonia planted the first vegetable garden the cabin had seen since Sarah's time, teaching Caleb with endless patience the names of the seedlings as they pushed up green through the thawing earth. In the evenings, the three of them together took to sitting on the porch as the light went long and gold across the plains, Caleb drowsy against his mother's shoulder, Thad's arm around them both, and more than once Thad found himself thinking that whatever hardship the past winter had cost them, it had purchased something on the other side of it that he would not have traded back for any amount of quiet, uncomplicated ease. It was some weeks later, once they had settled back into the cabin with Caleb filling its rooms with a small boy's endless noise and curiosity, that the final piece of the story arrived, delivered by the territorial marshal's office, along with a small trunk of Rosalind Blythe's recovered effects seized from Harlan Cross's estate as part of the settlement his conviction had eventually required. Among the letters and small keepsakes, a hairbrush, a faded photograph of two identical young women standing arm in arm before either life or grief, had marked them a christening gown. Rosalind had apparently sewn herself in, the months before Caleb's birth. Caledonia found a letter addressed in her sister's careful, familiar hand, not to herself but to a name she did not at first recognize, Thaddeus Vance. It had never been sent. It had been written, the date at its top revealed, some 4 months before Rosalind's death. Months, that was to say, before Caledonia had ever written her own first letter, proposing marriage, before either of them, as far as Caledonia had ever known, had heard the name Thaddeus Vance spoken by anyone at all. She read it that evening by the fire, her hands shaking with Thad watching in bewildered silence as her face moved through shock and grief, and finally something that looked almost like wondering joy. Rosalind had written of a blacksmith in Wyoming Territory whose advertisement for a mail-order bride she had encountered by chance in an old newspaper, kept by her for months afterward, though she herself had no thought of answering it. A widower, the notice said, patient and gentle, seeking a quiet second chance at family. She had made careful inquiries through channels Caledonia could only guess at now into the man's character and reputation, and had learned enough from neighbors and acquaintances willing to speak of him to become convinced that here was a man rare enough to trust with the two people she loved most in the world, and would she already feared by then not live long enough to protect herself. The letter unfinished broke off mid-sentence. Rosalind's declining health, perhaps, or simple exhaustion had stopped her pen before she completed whatever final thought she had meant to set down. But what remained was enough, more than enough, to reframe everything that had happened, since Rosalind had intended all along for her sister to find her way to Thaddeus Vance's door, not by accident, not merely as a convenient stranger's marriage to disappear into, but as a deliberate, carefully considered act of love and protection, a dying woman's final gift to both the sister and the son she would not live to see grown. Caledonia had believed all these months that she alone had chosen this path, chosen the marriage, chosen the deception, chosen to draw Harlan Cross's pursuit onto herself to protect her nephew. She had never known that the path itself had been laid down before her by a sister who loved her enough to plan from her own deathbed one final act of quiet, invisible guidance. "She knew you," Caledonia said softly, when she had finished reading the letter aloud to Thad in a voice thick with tears. "She never met you. She never could have. But she knew somehow, from nothing more than a newspaper notice and a few careful inquiries, exactly the kind of man you were. She sent me to you, Thaddeus. Not fate, not chance. My sister sent me to you because she trusted you with everything she had left to give her son and me, and whatever hope either of us had left of finding a life worth living after everything Harlan Cross took from us." Thad held the unfinished letter carefully as though it were something sacred, and thought of a woman he had never met dying far away with a stranger's newspaper advertisement clutched in her failing hope, choosing in her last months of life to trust a blacksmith she would never see with the two people she loved most. He thought of the birth certificate folded inside a worn shawl carried through a blizzard. He thought of a lullaby hummed without thinking in a cold, dark room. He thought of a wanted poster, a corrupt sheriff, a burning line shack, and a small boy's uncertain, courageous run across a spring yard into open arms. Outside the cabin window, a mare nickered softly in the corral, and somewhere beyond the tree line, a meadowlark had begun tentative and sweet, the season's first evening song, as if the whole of Wyoming itself had finally exhaled the long, hard breath it had been holding since the first snow fell the night Caledonia arrived. None of it he understood now, sitting there with his wife and Rosalind's letter, and the soft, steady sounds of Caleb sleeping in the next room had ever truly been an accident. It had been from its very first quiet beginning. One dying woman's final and most enduring act of love, a gift she would never live to see fully unfold, but one that had in the end given her sister a husband worth trusting her son, a father worth having, and a family neither of them had dared to hope they still deserved. In the years that followed, Thad would sometimes stand in the doorway of his forge on a quiet evening, watching Caleb chase fireflies across the yard, while a second child, a dark-haired girl with her mother's steady gray eyes, slept against Caledonia's shoulder on the porch, and think back to that first terrible night on the East Road, the wagon half buried in a drift, a stranger too frozen to speak, cradled in his arms. He had gone out that night, expecting at best a marriage of quiet convenience between two lonely people, making the best of circumstance. He had found instead a woman who had crossed half a continent not for her own sake, but for a child who was not even hers, to protect a woman brave enough to marry a stranger and clever enough to outlast men far more powerful than herself, a woman worth every risk he had taken and every fear he had weathered to keep her. Outside the Wyoming spring, deep in towards summer, the fields turning green beneath a sky finally entirely free of storm, and in the small cabin where a blizzard had once brought two frightened strangers together, a new and lasting warmth had at last come to stay.